Advice to every Australian is do not travel abroad.
Well, this is the most serious and dramatic escalation of this crisis.
Many countries already shutting their borders.
Most European Union partners will close their borders
into the United States,
to Canada,
Switzerland,
New Zealand.
Australians trapped in countries.
We need to get home.
We're expecting an 85% fall in net overseas migration.
We've had this artificial suspension of migration. The question really is what comes next?
It's mesmerising to watch. A galaxy of yellow dots, each representing 1,000 people, moving across the globe in a constant stream of migration. Until COVID-19, the virus not only brought migration to a crashing halt, it actually reversed it as people around the world returned to home base.
We are absolutely in a unique moment in history. It may be that we've never experienced a situation like this.
Travel bans, closed borders, countries turning inward and sending foreigners packing.
It is time to make your way home.
The future of global migration in limbo.
I think in the wake of the 2020 pandemic, we're going to see countries closing up more and net migration globally decreasing. In times of economic crisis, people often look for someone to blame, and we see that migrants and minorities very often become scapegoats.
COVID-19 could see potential migrants less open to moving.
Migration's a risky decision. They've got to calculate whether or not the risks and costs involved in migration are compensated for by the rewards they'll get in terms of higher income, better career prospects, better standard of living. And it's by no means certain that the risk will pay off.
But that's exactly the risk that millions of people have been taking for hundreds of years, and especially in the last half century or so. The real question is whether COVID-19 is likely to change that.
So the notion, the statement that we've reached the end of migration flies in the face of every single data point and driver and motivation that human beings have to move. And those motivations are multiplying, not receding.
And that points to the beginning of a migration boom.
Migration itself is certainly going to continue because, again, because of economic imperatives, because of political unrest, because of this pandemic paranoia, because of climate change, the desire, the pent-up desire to move is greater than ever before.
In fact, history tells us that far from discouraging people from moving, big global crises trigger big global migration. The Second World War triggered the largest movement of people in Europe's history. The Syrian conflict saw almost 6 million people flee across the world. And health crises are no different. The Ebola crisis, for example, saw hordes of people take flight.
In case of Ebola disease, people have been moving quite aggressively, but those movements were local. While with the COVID-19 pandemic, you might assume that the effects of human mobility in a post-pandemic world would really be larger.
The desire for safety, for stability, for decent quality of life, an environment in which one can raise one's children, have good education, adequate or basic health care. And we may have taken these items for granted, but not anymore.
New modelling from the University of Sydney suggests COVID-19 could drive people away from the hardest hit places towards countries like ours.
You also have this pandemic paranoia, people wanting to leave red zones that are not well governed, that don't have sufficient health care, to green zones that have better quality of life.
Australia handled this disease very well. We nearly eliminated the disease, so it's almost a no-brainer that it is an attractive destination.
But will Australia let them in? Some are already angling to pull up the drawbridge, calling for cuts to temporary migration.
My view, Labor's view, is that Australians need a fair go and a first go at jobs.
The stereotypes about migrants stealing jobs are simply untrue.
Others may seek to use the crisis as a weapon.
There is the risk that the effects of the pandemic will fuel nationalists' debates and approaches with the idea that every country now needs to shield itself from all the others.
We're seeing this stigmatisation of migrants and minorities as potential carriers and spreaders of the disease because they're the kind of vectors that carry the disease across borders.
Australians have complicated feelings about immigrants. A Lowy Institute poll found 54% had anti-immigration sentiments, with concerns over how immigration could be affecting Australia's identity. But the same poll found that 54% of respondents also said Australia's openness to people from all over the world is essential to who we are as a nation. But the migrant community has been crucial during this crisis. and they'll be essential to our recovery. Based on current trends, migrants are expected to contribute $1.6 trillion to Australia's economy by 2050.
Migrants have always been essential to the economy and to society of Australia. How essential they are in core services like the health service, in high-skilled professions that keep society going, as well as the coalface jobs that have been essential during the pandemic as well.
So for all the political debate around migration, our reliance on it may well mean that when it comes to the crunch, our government and others like it will have their hands forced.
I actually believe that we will move towards an all-out war for talent globally very, very soon. So some of the largest countries in the world are actively recruiting skilled migrants and competing for the talent pool.
Countries like Canada, which have a reputation of being very welcoming of migrants and will be stiff competition for Australia. And it's a competition that we will want to win, because without new arrivals, our economy would already have been in recession last year, well before the coronavirus hit.
In the day-to-day conversation, we have this real, tussle, and migration is such a hot-button issue. In reality, the balance of power among nations in the future is going to depend on actually actively recruiting people to bring in the talent and the knowledge of sort of workers who are going to drive innovation forward. So Australia should not in any way, shape, or form be complacent about the success that it's had. Every single year, it will have to compete to attract the best and the brightest and the wealthiest.
It's interesting, that balance between people being anti-immigration and then also liking Australia being an open country that accepts migrants from everywhere. And I think one of the troubling things about this for me is whether racism will be dished out, but under the mask of it being something that they're thinking about for health reasons. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't want people from other countries, and it ends up being racism, but the argument is because we don't want COVID back, or we don't, it's come from here. Or you've already seen a lot of the Chinese community here in Australia were just treated awfully at the beginning of this pandemic, even though they had, it was completely unjustified. So it'll be interesting to see what changes.
Right, it's time for a break. More coming up. Stay with us.